Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Surviving COVID-19 series. So I'm Bianca, and we also have Freya on with us as well.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Freya. So we'll be doing a bit of a mini series, doing kind of four webinars around surviving COVID-19 and kind of the main topics that come up and the main things that we think would be helpful in terms of managing through this really difficult time. So we will be kind of running through those weekly for the next couple of weeks. So we look forward to having you guys on board. So before we get started, we just wanted to acknowledge that COVID in general is a really difficult time for a lot of people. Today we'll be kind of talking about emotions and coping through COVID and what kind of emotions come up and some quick tools on how to cope with what's going on in the world at the moment. Before we get started, we thought it might be a good idea just to start to become a little bit mindful of what's going on for you, start to reflect on some of the things, that you might have been feeling over the last couple of weeks or, even the last 18 months, because this has been going for a long time.
Yeah.
So just getting in touch with some of those feelings, having a bit of a reflect on, how you are coping and what kind of things you might need to work on. And hopefully, these webinars will be helpful for you to implement some of those skills that we think could help you through this time.
Definitely. Couldn't agree more. All right, well, let's get started, everyone. Okay, so why are COVID-19 restrictions so hard? Why has it been so hard for so many people? And I think it really has been. And I guess it's really useful to look at the situation that's actually unfolding and maybe some of the factors that are contributing to what's going on. So one of the main emotions that I think has been coming up is worry and anxiety, sort of. And worry in general is triggered when situations are new, they're unpredictable, or they're ambiguous. So when we think about worry in terms of a new situation, if you have to go to a new place that you haven't been to before, you don't really know what to expect. And there can be that sort of forethought and concern about, what's going to happen. You can see how that sort of links to the current situation, Maybe we've been through lockdown once before, but this whole pandemic is something that none of us have ever experienced before. And it's all really new what we're going through. Unpredictability. So again, when there's not a lot of certainty about what the situation is going to look like moving forward, if we don't know how things are going to unfold, there can be a lot of worry about that and trying to figure out what is going to happen next. Again, I guess we can all sort of see how that relates to the current situation with the pandemic. Things are really unpredictable, and with the current restrictions that are happening, things are changing day to day, and that leads into ambiguity, I guess that means when things are sort of unclear, we don't really know what's happening. For example, changing recommendations about restrictions, changing recommendations about, I guess, protective gear, or, even the vaccines. There's a lot of ambiguity that's been happening previously in the messaging around the pandemic that we've all sort of had to sort of figure out and decide where we stand within all of this information that we've been given. So I guess the main message is here that given that the lockdown and the pandemic in general are all new, they're unpredictable, and there's ambiguity, it's really normal and sort of expected that our anxiety will be heightened with the current situation. And so on top of that, on top of these sort of like worries and situation that's happening, there's a whole lot of other really real things that are happening around us. Fears about like loss of income, loss of work, loss of illness as well. I think a lot of us have been affected by those really real fears that are happening. And on top of that, we're not able to access our normal social supports that we would use maybe in sort of tough situations. So what are some normal responses then to COVID-19 restrictions? And I guess the first thing to say is that most responses are going to be normal to it. There's going to be all sorts of different emotional responses that people are going to have. It might vary from day to day for you, or it might vary from person to person. Somebody in your household might be coping with this completely differently to you. And I guess the main thing to take away is that that's okay. it's okay to have a different response to the situation, because there's lots of different things that might be coming up currently. And as we sort of work through this as well, it might be helpful to think about maybe what is one of those things that you can sort of identify with, what's something that you've gone through yourself. So just to start off with, you know, current situation and in general with COVID, there's been a lot of loneliness, you know. We've had to self-isolate. We haven't been able to travel interstate or overseas to see those loved ones in general, family members. So we haven't been able to see the people that we really care about. And at the moment, with the COVID restrictions, lockdown restrictions, there has been, I guess, we haven't been able to either access those community supports as well. So I don't know, if we're thinking about school supports, that's a community that people might be part of, or I don't know, even your coffee shop. If you haven't been going to your coffee shop, you know, there's that sort of informal connection and support that you have with the people around you. And at the moment, those community supports have been really taken away from a lot of us. And I don't think we realised maybe some of those supports that we did have that actually were kind of meaningful. And it's been so hard to do that, because there's been a lot of fear about even like socializing, so you can't even access them in a lot of ways. And then on top of that, you know, the loved ones that we're not able to see at the moment. So understandably, I think a lot of people are feeling really lonely with what's going on. Yeah. So another thing that you might be going through is a feeling of unproductivity, lack of motivation, you know, sort of feeling like a bit like, you're thinking about that, like, just can't really be bothered to do stuff. You know, normally maybe you're kind of out there, go-getting, doing all these things, being really productive, getting on top of stuff. But with the current situation, I think a lot of people are feeling less motivated than they normally would, which is sort of difficult because, you know, we've got more time than we normally would. We don't have as many sort of responsibilities. We don't have to commute. We don't have to, you know, go to sport on the weekend or whatever it is. So we've got more time, but I think a lot of people are doing a lot less. And without that sort of routine, it's been really difficult to keep up with that, you know, motivation and that productivity that we might normally have. And I guess it's, again, just to sort of normalize it, you know, it's okay to have days when you're not being productive. It's a normal response, given that we've got so much of those other things going on that have been taken away from us, to feel maybe like a bit flat. Yeah. Grief and anger. So when we think about what's happening with the lockdown and the pandemic in general, there's been a lot of loss. We've lost a lot of things with the restrictions, and grief is a normal response to loss. It's the way we sort of process things, the way we sort of move through it and heal as well. So while it can be really difficult, you know, feeling this sense of sadness or loss with everything that's going on, like the loss of income, safety, social interactions, it's really normal because we have lost so much. We've lost normalcy, we've lost freedom, we've lost that physical closeness with people. So yeah, I think a lot of people are really grieving, and a normal way to grieve is to feel really angry and frustrated. Yeah.
And I think, you know, something we had touched on previously, Freya, too, was, you know, the loss of opportunity as well, you know, the loss of opportunity to plan future events, things like that, you know. And sometimes, you know, you're going to touch on this in a little bit too, but there is some guilt around that as well, because it's not something you physically lost, but it's something that, you know, you've lost the potential to do, which can be just as hard, I think, sometimes. And, you know, there is that grief around that too. And I think as you're processing grief, generally the first thing that comes up is anger. And so because we're still in that process of grieving, that anger can come through quite strongly at times.
That's so true. I think a lot of us are really going through that feeling of loss of, you know, opportunities. Yeah. And I don't think we talk about it very often, you know, in general, but it's legitimate. It's a legitimate feeling to be going through, I suppose. And we don't always let ourselves feel that, because there are, you know, we hear a lot of things about like so many other people are worse off than me. Yeah. All these responses are sort of valid, though, you know. There is a real loss that everybody's going through, and it might be in slightly different ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we touched on anxiety and worry as well, that feeling of uncertainty that a lot of people are going through, feeling of anxiety, leaving the house, fear of the illness and things like that. It's definitely coming up for a lot of people at the moment. And this one, I don't think we had last lockdown, Bianca, the fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
And I can sort of relate to this myself, is that sort of like this feeling of getting over it. It's like it's going on for a long time. We've been here before. We know what's in store for us. It's just a bit tiring, really.
Yeah, and I think the more it gets extended, the more fatigued people feel. It can be, I think too, it can be really tiring not knowing and having, those feelings of anxiety all the time. It's extremely exhausting. And
That's so true.
Get to a point where you feel really fatigued by all of it.
Definitely. And I think we'll touch on ways to sort of handle that fatigue in a few slides' time. But I think it's just sort of interesting thinking about it in terms of like burnout as well.
Yeah.
Like, when people go through like difficult times at work, you can feel that real sense of, as it goes on, that real sense of like tiredness, worn out. And I think we're all getting a little bit burnt out by this pandemic.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. And so we touched on that as well, guilt. So I guess even though it is so normal to have a lot of these responses, I think a lot of people feel like they shouldn't be feeling so upset, or they shouldn't be feeling angry. They should be coping with things, but it's not business as usual. This isn't a normal situation we're going through. And those expectations that we normally set for ourselves in terms of productivity or, I don't know, empathy or compassion, they're different expectations than we maybe should be having at the moment. And so I guess we'll just talk a little bit about guilt as well in the future. But again, just to reiterate that, lots of different emotional responses are normal in this situation.
I think too, it's important to point out all of these feelings are normal in a general setting. This is all normal day to day, regardless of the pandemic. And so, it's almost like a heightened sense of these emotions. And that's normal. It's normal to feel these generally. It's even more normal to feel them now. There's so much going on. So, having these emotions come up a bit more than usual is normal.
Yeah, I think that's so true. We've all still got our own lives going on with our own normal things that we'd have to be dealing with. And so maybe it's really bringing up these other emotions as well because of what you're going through personally at the moment, or, even your history of what you've gone through in the past. It can be really triggering in that way too. Bianca, I was wondering if you could sort of maybe tell us a little bit about if you identify with any of these emotions.
Oh, absolutely. I have been feeling quite anxious, I think, as everyone is, around the uncertainty and, those what ifs do start running through your head. What if we get extended? What if we're going to be in this for a long time? What does that mean for me? All of those what ifs, I think anxiety has been a big one for me. But there is a little bit of that guilt, maybe I don't have it as bad as other people. I'm still working, that sort of stuff. I think it's important to recognize those two things can be true at the same time, right? People can have it worse, but my feelings are still valid. Those two things you can hold at the same time, which I think has helped with the guilt. And I have been a little bit angry at times as well, just around, being frustrated with not being able to do normal stuff, go out with friends or, socialize on the weekends or see family, that sort of stuff. It does feel a bit frustrating at times. What about you, Freya?
Yeah, I can really relate to that feeling of frustration. Frustrated at maybe some of those losses that we're all going through at the moment. And also, just a bit worn down by it all. But I guess we'll talk about a little bit the ways that we can manage some of these emotions as well in a more healthy and sort of like cope with what's going on too.
Okay, so now we're just going to touch a little bit more on worry and anxiety, because this seems to be the one that we see coming up quite a lot. I think everyone can kind of feel this at the moment. So what is worry? So it is thinking about the future in a way that leaves us feeling anxious. So usually that's kind of, thinking through the what ifs of a situation, like I just mentioned, especially at a time like this, there's so much uncertainty. Our mind does just kind of run with those what ifs because we're not sure what's going to happen. And that tends to leave us feeling quite anxious. It's important to note that some worry is normal. It is an adaptive function, right? Worry is telling us that something's important or that we need to take note of something. You know, it's our body's way of saying, hey, listen up, I've got something important that you need to be aware of. But there is a point where it can become excessive and it can be a little bit too much and it can feel quite overwhelming. So that's when we really need to start maybe thinking about, okay, how do I change some of this stuff that's going on for me? In terms of the symptoms of worry, there's a lot of different symptoms of worry, and it's going to look different from person to person. But some of the common ones are kind of body tension, those muscle aches or pains. You might have difficulty concentrating, difficulty sleeping. That's when our minds tend to run and start thinking about, oh God, what do I have to do tomorrow? What's tomorrow going to look like? You know, there's an 11 a.m. press conference with Gladys, whatever it is. You know, all of those thoughts tend to come up as we're trying to go to sleep, and you know, some of that body tension as well, stuff like that all comes up around that night time often, but throughout the day as well. And then also feeling easily fatigued, and like we talked about, you know, sometimes it is that, you know, you've been feeling anxious for so long and so you're just getting tired, and that's, you know, your body, you know, being exhausted from all of those big emotions you've been feeling. But I think what's important about all of this as well, and all of the emotions we've talked about, is we typically have this kind of baseline, right, where you'll feel things normally, right? So your level of anxiety is usually around here, for example. And so when little things happen during the day, you know, you'll have a bit of anxiety and you'll be able to recover quite quickly. But because at the moment we're in this, you know, very difficult situation, our baseline's gone from here to here. Right. And so our baseline anxiety is so much higher than it was before. And so things that seem small or little, or things that shouldn't usually worry you, you know, it's going to feel a lot bigger because your baseline's gone up because of everything that's going on. So it's important to know that it's not just you. Everyone's going through this. Everyone's feeling a little bit more heightened than usual. And so those responses are probably going to feel a little bit bigger. Those emotions are going to feel a little bit bigger than usual. And I think it's important just to notice that and to give yourself some compassion around that as well. You know, it is a hard time and that is okay. So I think at the moment it would be good for everyone to just kind of think about what sort of emotions have come up for you throughout this, you know, pandemic. What's normal for you? What's maybe a little bit different for you? What are the main things that have come up for you, and why do you think that is? As you're thinking about that, I also want you to think about, you know, if you felt any of those kind of body sensations coming up, you know, how does that come up in your body for you? Is it muscle tension? Do you get headaches? Do you find it hard to concentrate? You know, how does that show up for you? So I guess we're going to try become a little bit more mindful of what's going on for us as we're going through this. And then by being mindful and being aware of what's going on for us, then we're able to put in some strategies to help us get through this time.
That's so true. And I think it can be really easy to sort of get caught up in that busy life of like working at home, things to do, that, you know, sometimes we don't really check in with ourselves about how we're feeling.
Yeah. So
that's a really good idea. Okay, so I guess with all of this in mind, it's still really helpful to think maybe what can we do to help manage and cope through the current situation. And one of the things that we've spoken a lot about already is that there is a lot of uncertainty in the situation and a lot of things are out of our control. You know, we can't decide where we're going, when we leave the house. Lots of things are out of our control. So when so much is out of our control, it's really helpful to think what is still in our control. And so a lot of these points will be about the things that you can do in your life at the moment to sort of help cope. So with worry, while it can feel really helpful to stay informed, and it is really good to stay informed from reliable news sources, actually, you know, overwhelming yourself and getting really deep into that sort of information can actually be really overwhelming, and it can exacerbate that anxiety. So maybe it's helpful to think about, like, what is a good amount of media consumption I'm going to be doing about this COVID pandemic? You know, is it going to be like, I'm going to check the news twice a day and get that relevant amount of information and that's going to be enough? Or is it, limiting it to just watching the press conference? These are also personal questions to ask yourself about what is the right amount. But I guess a sort of point to start is saying that some people sort of recommend 2 times a day checking in on that information and just sort of letting it go for the rest of the day. Because while we spoke about worry being normal to a certain extent, if that worry starts to take over your whole day and you find yourself thinking about the situation constantly, that's not a really helpful way to cope with a situation. We should still be able to sort of live a semblance of a bit of a normal life with doing other activities as well. So I guess some of the things to think about is, how long will you watch the news? How many digital notifications will you get? Will you turn off those notifications to apps? Are you using social media and you follow lots of news sources and incidentally come across that news, or your friends posting about it? So think about that sort of incidental information that you're kind of having come into as well in the amount that you want to expose yourself to.
I think that's a really good point, Freya, because I've talked about it actually to a lot of clients around this whole news consumption thing, and it almost seems like it's less about just letting the information go, and it's more about making an active choice to unsubscribe or to not check social media, because we are coming across it, especially in this digital age, so much more easily. It's so accessible, it's right there. And so I find it's quite easy to fall into, that's that news article, that headline looks really important, I should read that. And then you end up consuming all this stuff that maybe you didn't want to. So it's more about, I think, actually making an active choice to not check social media, to unsubscribe, to turn off those notifications. It's one of those things that's very easy to fall into. So it has to be kind of an active choice not to engage in it.
Definitely. And it can feel like things are evolving really fast. And so it can be tempting to sort of like keep checking for updates, keep doing this. But what is the impact going to be on your well-being, and how much time are you really spending thinking about COVID? Because I guess that's the big thing. It's that COVID feels really overwhelming and you're thinking about it all the time and asking those what if questions. And that leads on to the next point, that stress can be infectious. If we're talking to people a lot about COVID all the time and they're giving you all that information and updating you, and it's creating that sense of fear, and they're showing that anxiety as well, that can be really overwhelming to hear. And if you, I guess, have a moment to think about, are you talking to all your people in your life about COVID? Do you have any conversations that don't involve talking about COVID? And setting those boundaries as well with those people in your life can be really important, because it can be, a lot of people sending that updated article about what's happening or whatever it is. But to think about yourself in this situation and set that boundary if somebody is talking about it, to just say, I just need some space from that sort of conversation, or even lead the way to sort of say, I'm just not going to engage in conversations about this. I think maybe we should talk about other things that are going on in our lives. What TV shows are you watching? So try and lead a bit by example, but also talk about what your needs are in this situation. And that can be really to open up that conversation for others too, because maybe they're feeling overwhelmed talking about it. And the next one is, I guess, to postpone your worry. And it's a psychological strategy that I know we talk a lot about at CORE when worry does come up in general. So I guess the main idea is to notice if you're having a lot of worry, and acknowledge it when it does come up. If you notice yourself falling into those sort of what if questions, what's going to happen in the future, trying to foretell what will happen in the future. I guess notice that worry to begin with, and then allow yourself to let that worry go, and allow yourself to think about that worry at a later date, because we don't want that worry to take up your whole day. It's about giving yourself some specific time of the day to think about the things that are coming up, because it can be overwhelming, and giving yourself that time to push it back, to say, I'm going to think about this, in the afternoon for half an hour. And so you're acknowledging the worries when they do come up, but also giving yourself some space to do other things too.
Yeah, it's a really good strategy, and a very targeted strategy, I think, particularly like we talked about, a lot of those worries coming up overnight. It can be really helpful in those sorts of situations. And so like Freya said, you kind of set this time aside. So you might set, 10, 15, 20 minutes a day And that could be any time of the day, whatever you pick, generally not before bedtime, because that's when we kind of want to be postponing the worries. So it might be, you know, for example, 10:30 every morning, I'm going to have my worry time for 15 minutes, right? So you set that in place. Anytime outside of that time a worry comes up, you want to take note of it, acknowledge it, like Freya said. If you think it's really important, you can write it down. But I guess the trick is, if it's really a big worry that you need to be worried about, you should remember, come the next day at worry time. So every time a worry comes up, you just kind of acknowledge it, let it be there, let it go, and then just think, okay, I will worry about that tomorrow at my worry time. When worry time does roll around and you do have that 15 minutes, what you should do then is write down or make a mental note of all the worries you have for the day. Then what's helpful to do is cross out anything that's not in your control, because there's nothing you can do about what's not in your control. You can't make any of that better. You know, you're not going to be able to predict when we'll come out of lockdown, that sort of stuff. So anything that's not in your control, cross it off, because there's no point worrying about it if it's not in your control. And yes, it's going to come up, but you know, it's not something you can actively problem solve. The other thing you should cross off is anything that doesn't need to be worried about that day. So if you're thinking about something that's 6 months down the track, you probably don't need to action anything for that today. So cross that off your list. Then what you'll be left with is a list of things that are in your control and need to be done today. And you have a really succinct list of actionable points to relieve those worries. And then the only worry is really that you need to action on that day. So it helps you to kind of, I guess, prioritize your worries, cross off what's not important, and give you like a succinct list where you can problem solve through those things.
Yeah, that's a really good way of talking about it. And I guess it makes things a lot more manageable.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So with loneliness, I think we're all sort of missing those loved ones in our lives. And like I spoke about, we're sort of missing those people we didn't think we'd miss either. You know, those casual conversations that you might have at work or at school or whatever it is with those people. So while we would normally be getting these casual sort of contact and social connection with people, we're going to have to make more of a concerted and a conscious effort to try and connect with people, because it's not just happening as easily as it would in the normal world. And while definitely acknowledge that it's not the same doing it through a screen, it can still be helpful to connect, you know, online, on the phone, in those ways, to stay connected with the people around us. So I guess a good way to connect with your loved ones is to think about some activities that you can do together. It sort of takes a little bit of that pressure off that Zoom call or that phone call or whatever it is, and can just be a good way to connect with people online. I've got a list, I've got sort of a website later on that you can have a look at for places to start, but you know, it might even be like cooking a meal together or I don't know, playing a game together. Have you done anything like that, Bianca?
I have had a few like FaceTimes while we're doing just like random activities, you know, boring stuff like cleaning, you know, just when you want someone to just have a chat to. So wiping down the kitchen bench where you just have someone there, but you don't even have to be, you know, talking the whole time. It takes a bit of the pressure off, you're right. And it just kind of is that, you know, nice to have a bit of company. I think especially if you're living alone, stuff like that is really helpful.
Very true, very true. And then keeping connected with your colleagues. I guess if you are working or you are not able to work, but you still have those colleagues from work, I think it's a really good idea to try and keep connected with those colleagues. And I know it can be awkward and I know it's not ideal, but they actually can be really rewarding and really helpful to sort of break up those days, because it can be really isolating to work alone and feel like you don't have anybody else doing their job, but everybody's still out there just in sort of separate places. So it's a great idea to have a scheduled, regular sort of group interaction and breaks. Hopefully people's workplaces are doing this already. But if they're not, you know, we can take that initiative to try and like start something up, maybe like a little check-in at, you know, coffee break in the morning, or, you know, end of the day debrief, whatever it is. If it can be like a regular thing, so it's already in the diary, it doesn't feel like an extra nuisance. And I think we were talking about this as well, Bianca, really setting that intention and following through on it of going.
Absolutely. I think it's one of those things that's very easy to see in your diary and go, oh, I'm just not going to do that. I don't have time, or I have other things to do. But But yeah, I think you're right. Setting that intention and just saying yes. You know, if you give it a go once, I think you'll find that it's probably not as bad as you thought it was going to
Yeah.
be. And once you've done it the one time, it'll become easier. It'll be part of your routine. And I think just, you know, making a real effort to say yes to that sort of stuff, even when you don't want to, can be really helpful.
Yeah, so true, so true. I guess the next one is when we're feeling lonely and like isolated in the world, it can be really helpful to look out and to look at other people and like try and find those connections. And a really good way of doing that is to, you know, help others and to lean into empathy and connection with other people in our world. It doesn't even have to be our loved ones, but, you know, finding somebody on the street when you go for a walk who you can smile at, say good morning, you know, those things can be huge. And just the act in and of itself of helping somebody else or being kind to somebody else is so rewarding. And I guess another way to do that is to, you know, offer support to a loved one, you know, check in on them, see what you can do to help them as well. Yeah. Okay. So what else can we do to help? So with grief and anger, yeah, there's a lot of that guilt as well around those emotions coming up. And I think it's really good to acknowledge those emotions and to just allow yourself to feel them without judgment. And we'll talk about that. And this can be really applied to all of these sort of different emotions coming up. But that self-compassion is so important in what we're all going through at the moment. And I think we're going to talk about that more in module 4. So we hope to see you guys there to talk about that in depth. But also just to remember that all of these emotions, grief as well, but all of the emotions are transient. So that means that they can feel like they're going to go on forever, but they will go and we will experience different things. And so just to give yourself that reassurance when you are going through a hard time and you are feeling angry, this will be okay, we will get through this. And I guess to help with that point, it's to really like give yourself some time each day to check in and ask, how am I doing today? What is going on with me? How am I feeling? What's happening in my body? Yeah. Okay, so unproductiveness and lack of motivation. These are really simple and seem really obvious, but I guess it's worth reiterating. Get enough sleep. Get those 8 hours, you know, get to bed at a normal time. And that's about routine too. So trying to maintain that normal sleep cycle that you would be having. Let's try not to slip too far into sleeping in the morning and missing the day, because it's really helpful to get sleep at night, daylight and sun during the day. And so we'll talk a lot more about routine next week in the next module. But I guess a little tip in terms of sleep, just think a little bit about how much alcohol am I consuming. We think alcohol can be helpful to get to sleep. It actually causes disrupted sleep. And caffeine, obviously, is going to make you more, I guess...
Restless.
Yeah, restless, exactly. And less likely to fall asleep easily. The next one, exercise. Again, these are simple things, but they're really helpful if we can try and schedule them in regularly.
Yeah.
I think we don't have that normal sort of incidental exercise that we would be doing, walking to the office, you know, walking to, I don't know, the school or whatever it is. Going to the gym, we can't go to the gym either. So maybe it's about trying new ways to do exercise that you wouldn't normally have been doing. But finding a way to keep your body moving can be really helpful for sleep and motivation as well.
And I think too, if that's something you're struggling with, just starting with small things, you know, whether that's just going outside and being in the sun for 5 minutes a day, you know, just start with the really small goals. And once you start ticking those off, you'll start to feel a little bit more productive and like maybe you can push yourself a little bit further. But I think initially it's just about that little push, you know, whether it is going outside for 5 minutes a day or, you know, going for a walk around the block, whatever it is, it can be as small as you like, just starting to get your body moving a little bit.
That's so true. It doesn't have to be, you know, a 2K run.
No.
It is just finding a way to get in touch with your body too, to ground yourself.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So fatigue, I guess, yeah, it's about that self-compassion. Like, we're going through a hard time. It is tiring. We are going to feel tired at times. That's okay. But a way to help combat those feelings of fatigue is to just find a routine that works for you and stick to it. Another really good one to do is to like communicate your needs. How are you feeling? What do you need? Do you need some time alone to just process what you're going through? You know, we're all stuck inside with like, you know, it could be by yourself or it could be, you know, 5 other people, your kids. It's all a different situation, but within that, it's really important to let those around you know what you do need. Because it might seem obvious to you that you're just fed up and you need some space, but letting others know can be really helpful to bring them into that and to help with a solution. Maybe you need more support, and that's okay as well. You know, a lot of those supports we normally would get aren't there, but I think the people around us do want to try and help each other out too. And the guilt as well. You know, maybe we need to reevaluate the expectations that we have for ourselves at the moment. Maybe we won't be feeling fantastic, and that's okay. Maybe we won't be getting the washing done, and that's okay. You know, maybe online working from home isn't going to be the same as working from the office, and that's okay. And again, we'll talk more about working from home and learning from home in the future too. And a big one, mindfulness. I've just put it there. I'm going to talk about it more, guys, in future modules, so please do join us. Okay, so these are just helpful places to start. There's so much out there on the internet. No, you don't need me to tell you that. Just give it a Google, find some tips. These are just some helpful places to start, and it's definitely not a comprehensive list, but yeah, give it a go. You know, try one of these things. At the moment, it's a time to try new things.
Right. All right. So to summarize, again, there's lots of different emotions coming up, and that is completely okay and completely normal. You want to give yourself some time to check in on those emotions every day. You know, check in, how are you feeling? How is your body feeling? You know, what is that telling you? You know, just being a little bit more mindful and a little bit more aware of what's going on for you. And that's going to then lead us into coping, right? So how am I going? What am I feeling? What's going on for me? How am I coping at the moment? And then after that, we want to consider strategies that we can use. So we've talked through a few today. So what we want you to do now is to think about some of those strategies and just make an intention to give something a go in the next week. Anything from today, anything that you already know that you've been meaning to do that you know, might give a go now, set an intention. Think about, okay, I'm going to intentionally do this next week, and I'm going to try, and I'm going to see how it feels for me. Try some of those strategies on, see how it feels, experiment with them, you know, whatever works for you. Freya, I'm wondering if you have one of the strategies that you're going to try this week.
Yeah, I think I might try and set some boundaries in terms of talking about COVID to the people around me, because I've sort of fallen into that trap about, you know, spending a lot of time talking about it. I think it's getting to the point where it might not be helpful anymore. So I'm going to try and just talk to the people around me about not talking about COVID all the time.
Great.
What about you, Bianca?
I think what I'm going to do is try actively put some boundaries up around my media consumption. I have already decided that the press conference in the morning I'll only watch for 10 minutes, because I ended up sitting there watching the entire thing and getting really, really anxious. So I watched for the first 10 minutes only. I set an alarm on my phone so that, you know, I get the numbers and then I'm out, because I don't need to know all the other stuff right now. But I think over the next week, I'm going to unfollow some of those kind of media pages that I've been following and just try and make an active effort not to click on every news article that comes up about COVID, which can be really tempting. So I'm going to try really hard to do that.
That's a great idea. I'm keen to hear how they go next time when we check in with each other for module 2.
Yeah, and we will, you know, obviously we won't be live, but we will be asking you guys to check in with yourself on how you did on that intention. So make sure you kind of write it down or put it somewhere so that you remember what it is that you were going to do this week, and really give it a go. And moving forward, so we have 3 more modules. So we'll be starting next week with planning and maintaining routine. So that's something we kind of touched on today, having a is really important, but how to go about that and how to maintain that through all of this is what we'll be going through next week. Following that, we'll be doing managing working from home and learning from home, which is a massive struggle, I think, for a lot of people at the moment.
Yeah.
Especially if both of those things are happening at the same time, can be really tricky. And then module 4, we'll be talking through mindfulness, self-care and compassion. So again, we kind of touched on some of that stuff today, but we'll be going a little bit more in depth with that next time. So before we wrap up, maybe just check in again with yourself, see how you're feeling. Notice any of those feelings, thoughts, any of those body sensations coming up for you. Just check in with yourself, have a bit of a reflect on how you're doing, and think about, what is my intention for the next week.
Great. Thanks so much, Bianca, and we'll see you all next week.
See you guys next time.